Do you like ancient Egypt and old-timey adventure serials and the movie The Mummy and great insight into the making of movies? I know I do, so this book should be awesome, right? Wrong. It is pretty crap. So this is Resurrecting the Mummy, the making of the movie. So it's just a book on the first Mummy movie from 1999. And the problems with this book are sort of immediately apparent. I mean, first of all, it's a pretty unimpressive cover, I think. And as you can see, extremely thin. Let's see how many pages it is. So 96, which means it kind of looks and feels like a magazine, which is a sensation that is then confirmed by the actual text in the book. It really does just feel like an extra long magazine piece on this movie, and not even necessarily a good one, which is a real shame because I like I said, really like this movie and really love the themes of these sort of adventure movies, and I was really hoping for really great insight into how a big movie, a big adventure movie like this is made, and you just don't get that in this book. That's probably worth saying. My favorite part of this book definitely is the behind the scenes photos. It has got some pretty good behind the scenes photos, however it's also got way too many screenshots. But like I was saying, you'd expect them to be using the limited page number very wisely, and they just don't. So you saw back here, every so often you'll get these sort of yellowy orange pages, and all that is just recapping the story. So I'm guessing you've probably already seen the movie if you're reading this book, and then you get pages like this, which is actually has nothing to do with the actual production of the movie. It's more just facts on ancient Egypt, non-fiction on ancient Egyptian, like here it's got stuff on mummification and things like that. And I understand the sort of logic of putting that in here, and I'm absolutely fascinated by all this stuff, but it is the sort of stuff that, like, if you sort of know really anything about ancient Egypt at all, even if you only remember it from school or something, you pretty much know all the information they present in here. There's nothing particularly amazing on that front, and also it does kind of feel a little out of place, like it doesn't belong in this book. This book should have focused more on the movie. So it says it's the making of the movie, so I wasn't necessarily expecting a ton of art, but on the back cover it says with over 100 photos and artworks. So I was expecting a little bit of concept art, the concept art for like the ancient Egyptian part, and also maybe like costume designs for Rick and the sort of capturing the sort of 1930s adventure serial world, and there really isn't. Pretty much the only concept art you saw at the very first page is this. A lot of other stuff sort of like this. It really is only art on sort of like the mummification of Imhotep. There's nothing else in terms of concept art in the book. And so at the start they talk about the sort of legacy of the earlier mummy movies from Universal in the 30s, and I was expecting that also to be a lot more interesting. It wasn't. And then it very briefly touches on any sort of pre-production, and really sort of starts to launch quickly into the making of the movie. And so then you get these pages that's just really on the characters and actors, and all that is just information on sort of like the actors' background, praising them for why they're the most amazing people were the only ones who could possibly play this role. And then it's filled out with a lot of sort of information on the actors talking about something I absolutely hate in making of books and on DVD behind the scenes features, which is where actors don't actually talk about the making of the movie. They just talk about like their characters, who their characters are, and their motivations and things like that, recapping things you would already know about their characters based on having seen the film, and I always hate that. And so then what's wrong with the rest of the text when it does actually go on to talk about the production of the film? It does something else I'm not a big fan of that a lot of making of books and information pieces do, which is that in an attempt to capture a history of the making of a movie. That's, making films is such a large, big, involved process. And when people try and capture that whole experience in a very small amount of space, you really only get a very bird's eye view of the production. And looking at it from those heights, a lot of productions actually are very similar. So the information being presented is very similar to other things. So it's a lot of like names, place names, numbers. Like, it'll be like the production moved to so and so on this date and shot with this many extras for this many days, and it required this many construction workers to shift this much sand for this amount of time, and then production moved to another place, and then rattles off more numbers. And while that stuff absolutely is interesting, there's something not very engaging about it, reading about it, because like I said, from that broad perspective, most films look the same. It's just, you're just changing names and places and numbers and things like that. And it feels like the sort of stuff I've read about. It could almost be talking about almost any movie, which does make me wonder about the sort of, perhaps, when you've only got limited space, the futility in trying to capture an entire production, and if perhaps it's better to actually focus on the trees rather than the woods. Maybe sort of like do a day in the life of the production or something like that. Try and find out maybe some more of the minutiae, the challenges specific to a specific scene in this film, and focus more on the details. I wonder if that could be a better approach, or actually a mix of both is probably better, but this book just really doesn't do that. But then what's really bizarre about this book is then it gets to this section, which is like, the last 20 pages out of 100, so the last fifth of the book, and then it actually turns into a really great making of book, which was bizarre. I was so fed up with this book up to this stage, but I kept reading it anyway to make sure I got a full understanding of the book, and then it just suddenly really gets it together by the last fifth of the book. But what this section is it's just on the special effects used to create Imhotep, and the sort of stuff they're describing in this last section is really good. I wish the whole book had been like this section, and it would have been great. But the information here, this movie came out over 15 years ago, so the stuff they're talking about with like the CGI technology is very primitive, and even if you've got an only very limited understanding of how movie special effects are created using computers, you'll basically already have more knowledge than what's presented in this book. But the thing is, I'm sort of also trying to judge the text and the way it's described based on the fact this came out in 1999, in which case it would have actually been really good, serve as a really good introduction and explanation to people who, at a time when people were not as familiar with this sort of technology. So it's actually pretty great from that sort of perspective. And look at these great models and the descriptions of how everything was made, and the process is really good. It's such a shame that it only that the book really picked up in this last section. Unfortunately, despite that, it just is too little too late, I think, and it's definitely not enough to save the rest of the book. Also, it may be worth noting, there is, to my knowledge, no making of book for The Mummy Returns, but there is for Tomb of the Dragon Emperor.